A hot take and a question, but my hot take comes first. I recently watched the new iCarly reboot and I didn't like it very much. It was sort of predictable and desaturated, and just not super funny. Hot take aside, this got me thinking about the rise and fall of the sitcom genre. The old iCarly was basically a sitcom for kids, but now that it's a sitcom for adults, I don't think it holds up very well, and I have a few ideas about why this may be and what the effects of it are. I want to take you on a brief history lesson about the rise and fall of situational comedies, its birth, its legacy, and its death. Let's get into it.
Girls come up to me and they walk up to you and they're looking at you like this. And you're just sort of standing there and they look at you and they go, well, you're you. Yeah, I'm me.
So before I get into the history of sitcoms, let's define what a sitcom actually is. A sitcom is a comedy series that features a recurring cast of characters in various successive comedic situations. The basic formula for a sitcom is that each episode has a main plot, story A, as well as two subplots, stories B and C. There are 3 main acts divided by 2 commercial breaks with 3 to 5 scenes per act. Also note that one of the distinguishing characteristics of sitcoms, as opposed to other forms of television, is that the main protagonists barely change from one episode to the next. This definition and formula is pretty dense, and it obviously isn't totally set in stone, but it gives you an idea of what the general pacing and stories are like. Just remember that it has a main cast of characters who barely change, and a main plot and 2 subplots. Anyways, before we had television, we had radio, and what's accredited to creating the sitcom format and later genre is the 1926 Sam and Henry show on WGN Radio. In 1928, the name would later be changed to Amos and Andy, and funnily enough, the format inspiration for Amos and Andy was based off a comic strip called The Gumps that started about 10 years later. Performers Freeman Gosman and Charles Correll took inspiration from The Gumps in the sense that it was a cast of recurring characters doing funny and relatable things, basically a much shorter version of our previously defined sitcom formula. Another thing to mention about Amos and Andy and The Gumps is that it gained popularity primarily because it was funny and relatable to white, middle-class Americans, but in 2 completely different ways. The Gumps was mostly relatable in the sense that it purposely depicted an ordinary family living an ordinary life doing ordinary things. Amos and Andy, on the other hand, was popular with white Americans at the time because it was really, really fucking racist. Even though the beginning of the sitcom genre was off to a rocky start in retrospect, this formula absolutely exploded. So in that little gap between Amos and Andy and television being widely accessible to the public, we had shows like the Jack Benny program, which was awesome and blended sketch comedy with situational comedy, and Fibber McGee and Molly, which sort of became the blueprint for your standard married couple sitcom. Which brings me to I Love Lucy, literally one of the greatest and most iconic sitcoms ever. Okay, yeah, we technically had Mary Kay and Johnny before that, but I Love Lucy is objectively more iconic. I Love Lucy is an American cultural milestone. The basic premise is that the main character Lucy is a naive but ambitious housewife who dreams of stardom, living with her husband Ricky, who is a Cuban-American singer and band leader. It's a pretty basic premise that, in my opinion, would not work without the absolutely electric performances from Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz. It's hard to tell you just how good this show is if you haven't actually seen it, but I can give you a pretty good idea of how impactful it was. The episode Lucy Goes to the Hospital, where Lucy gives birth to her first child, had 44 million viewers when it premiered. To put it in other words, 73% of American households with TVs were watching this all at the exact same time. To put it in other words, this had about twice as many viewers as Eisenhower's inauguration, which aired literally the day after. So as much as I want to keep talking about I Love Lucy, I have to move on. Another 50s sitcom I want to briefly mention is The Honeymooners, which has such a different tone and take when comparing it to I Love Lucy. It's a sitcom, but with a little bit of a tragic spin to it. Taking place in an apartment complex in New York, couple Ralph and Alice Cramden have a pretty 1950s dynamic about them. Ralph is an everyman underdog who struggles to make his life better. And Alice is a victim of his constant threat of physical abuse. Putting all of that away, let's dive into the 60s, what I'd call the wholesome era of sitcoms. You had things like the Andy Griffith Show and the Dick Van Dyke Show, you know, the simple American, simple pleasure types of shows. Shows that were sweet, where characters love each other and always ended on a happy note. More interestingly though was the 70s, which had shows like MASH, The Mary Tyler Moore Show, and All in the Family. The 70s is famously a rebellious phase in America. Anti-racism, anti-war, and women's rights movements were on the rise. Culture was diversifying art and music. Watergate happened. And sitcoms really started to reflect these ideals. MASH, for example, was a military dramedy, relaying the anxieties of war to the American people while also portraying these young soldiers as ultimately human. You also had the Mary Tyler Moore Show, which openly discussed equal pay for women, workplace harassment, premarital sex, women's bodily autonomy, and homosexuality in a way that was comedic and easily digestible. Similarly, All in the Family revolved around a working class family talking about racism, religion, war, poverty, and way more. But these were all comedies. Like, remember that. This is really when something shifted about the sitcom genre. Of course, the 50s and 60s were just as reflective of their era, but more importantly, 70s sitcoms were reflective of their issues, but in a way that didn't talk down to their audience. Another thing I'd like to briefly touch on in regards to the 70s was the change in cast, which would later have a massive impact on the golden age of sitcoms. No longer are you seeing families doing typical family stuff, but instead you're seeing people at war and women in the workforce, groups of friends who acted like family. This didn't dissolve the family setup though. I mean, the point of All in the Family was, well, being a family, but this also shows a change in their target audience. Young people, the new generation. Okay, a quick recap before I jump into the 80s and on. Late 40s and early 50s sitcoms were focused on middle America and the narrow family aspect, examples being I Love Lucy, Mary Kay and Johnny, and The Honeymooners. The 60s kept the family dynamic, either showing a wholesome and or conservative version of a literal family like with the Dick Van Dyke Show, or a similar, less literal dynamic with a found family as seen on the Andy Griffith Show. The 70s began to adopt the found family aspect with things like MASH and the Mary Tyler Moore Show, while also reflecting a more realistic depiction of America's livelihoods, politics, anxieties, and the responses to their ever-changing world. The point of this recap is to demonstrate how each decade is building off each other, but also ties into the decade that they aired in. This will later hurt sitcoms. A lot. But we'll talk about that later. So, as you might have guessed, the 80s and 90s took the found family dynamic and absolutely ran with it. Particularly in the 80s, we have shows like Cheers, about the patrons and staff of a small bar, Frasier, a Cheers spin-off about a single psychiatrist comedically coping with his recent divorce, Friends, about a group of friends who can somehow afford a massive apartment in New York, and, of course, my favorite, Seinfeld, about another group of friends battling the destructive force of Kramer. So yes, basically we have fully formed a completely new audience in the 80s and 90s. Similar to the 70s, sitcoms are really starting to appeal to younger generations. Of course, we had family sitcoms like The Nanny and Blossom, but this new subgenre of sitcoms also gave writers room to sneak in that family dynamic formula while applying it to characters that their audience could really see themselves in. And that segues into something I also want to talk about. The formation of the Black sitcom. So, okay, you might be wondering, why do we have to talk about such a niche section of the sitcom genre? And look, I'll tell you why. Well, okay, first of all, fake person that I'm arguing with, it's not niche, but historically, the rise of Black actors and representation on TV, especially in sitcoms, is really, really important. You may remember a few minutes ago when I was talking about how the sitcom genres started out pretty rough. And although we have sitcom variety shows that featured Black people, like the Jack Benny program, this is one of the first times ever in American history that we're seeing a huge part of our population portrayed in a family setting. One that was missing from television almost entirely. And more importantly, Blackness became a main part of the casting and culture of these shows. We had The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, Sister Sister, The Cosby Show, Family Matters, Kenan and Kel, The Steve Harvey Show, and so many more, especially approaching the mid-2000s. Speaking of which, let's go over to the 2000s really quickly. Although the 2000s era of sitcoms aren't as notable as the 80s and 90s, it's still worth mentioning that they're continuing on with the found family dynamic. But what's new about the 2000s is that families are starting to feel a lot more offbeat and dysfunctional. Some notable examples of this being Curb Your Enthusiasm, Two and a Half Men, and Arrested Development. Then, of course, with the rise in TV channels in the 2000s, studios also started building a niche and culture surrounding sitcoms. No longer do we have a sitcom for everybody, but we're beginning to see shows like The Big Bang Theory, The Office, and How I Met Your Mother. And if you've been on Tinder at least once in your life, you know exactly what I mean when I say that people can make these shows their entire personality. It's also worth noting on my end that attaching your identity with a sitcom didn't just start with The Office, 2000 sitcoms. In fact, Friends was one of the first series that started this phenomenon, like the "Are you a Rachel or Monica, a Chandler or Ross" kind of thing. The same concepts from the 2000s pretty much apply to the 2010s. Either dysfunctional or imperfect families or found families. Notably, the 2010s also brings us more diversity in things like age, race, and sexuality. These things aren't necessarily more woke, but I would consider them to be a more modern approach to the workplace and family dynamics. Like with Modern Family, although the show is predominantly white, having a gay couple and a Hispanic woman be part of the main cast has made for some really interesting conversations regarding homophobia and anti-immigration within the realm of the series. Okay, that pretty much covers everything, but we're not in the 2010s anymore, are we? So what are sitcoms really starting to look like now? Well, since we're not too far into the 2020s, it's hard to tell what our decade of sitcoms will look like, if they're even memorable at all. Right now, it seems like there's more of a direction towards older audiences again, with things like The Goldbergs, Blackish, Man with a Plan, Mom, Fuller House, etc. Now, I think I know why this is. Cable is a fucking dumpster fire right now. It's just awful. Sitcoms really thrive on that weekly airing dinner time schedule that cable has so graciously given them these past couple of decades. But people my age do not have cable anymore, but my parents do. Thus, the sitcom formula has once again turned to them. I'm not saying that sitcoms are failing because younger people like me don't like them, but also, yeah, I kinda am. As we learned before, the younger generation plays a huge part in making something a cultural milestone. But what's stopping us as a younger audience from loving sitcoms? Besides the fact that most live-action sitcoms are now geared towards people our parents' age, we are not a family-oriented generation. Millennials are statistically having fewer and fewer children, and Gen Zers are mostly children, so the family dynamic doesn't really cater to us. Animated sitcoms like Tuca and Birdie still offer a much more realistic depiction of adult life as a millennial, living with roommates and working your ass off. And other animated sitcoms like Bob's Burgers and Rick and Morty, albeit very different shows, use family dynamics in a fun, subversive way. But even then, animated series that were created to parody sitcoms are really only standing because of their cultural legacies. In conclusion, times are changing, households are changing, and sitcoms as a format are either too rigid to change or refuse to change entirely. With the popularity of streaming services, there has been a rise in interest in shows that focus primarily on character developments and conflict. However, as I mentioned before, the general sitcom formula doesn't make any room for that to happen. Sitcoms are no longer trying to channel what's now, but instead keep coming back to what was. The white picket fence America, the family first America, the well-off America. Sitcoms are just not relatable anymore, and it certainly seems like they're not even trying to be. The reason why The Office and Friends became such a huge staple to people's personality is because their audience was able to characterize themselves as part of the main cast. But what do I have in relation to a character like Mrs. Goldberg? Unfortunately, nothing. So let me ask you this. In an age where the newest generation of adults are still living in their childhood homes and working minimum wage jobs after college, is there even room for our own character development in the extremely shitty sitcom that is The American Life?